As Peter said, this is a joint project, and this is the second big output of this project. The first was published last year in Economic History Review, where we looked in particular at a data set we had collected about Clonmel Jail in Tipperary. This one is also based on a new data set we've collected on Kilmainham Jail in Dublin, and we use both to try and analyse this topic. Which may not be immediately obvious what it's about from the title, but it fits within a literature called anthropometrics. So I will try and explain what anthropometrics is all about and how this fits within that. And the way I've structured this paper also as a sort of a warning for those that are unfamiliar with this kind of talk. It's originally designed. We're going to try and aim this at an economics audience, and so what I'm doing here is I'm using history to try and make a point in economics, right? So it's maybe a little bit unusual for those who are historians in the room or studying history, where you study an event or a trend or something in the past to try and learn about that particular event or episode. Right. What I'm doing here is using this as an experimental laboratory, if you like, to find out about a more general phenomenon that we see in other famines and other natural disasters or man-made disasters. Right? And the methodology that I'm using here is much more economic or econometric. So it's using regression analysis, statistical analysis of very large data sets. And there are some, I would argue, implications for the study of the Great Irish Famine, but we're also trying to plug this into a greater literature, a wider literature that takes in, for instance, the Chinese Great Leap Forward famine, the famines associated with the 20s and 30s policies of in Stalinist Russia, even the small famines at the end of the Second World War in the Netherlands, say. So all these we can learn from, I think, what we do here, and that's also our intended audience. So if it frustrates you a little bit as to, why isn't he going over the historical context in as much detail as I would expect, it's because that's what this is what it's designed to do. But bearing that in mind, if you have any questions at any time, please just raise your hands and I'll take them immediately, or if I don't take it immediately and I've seen you, it's because I don't want to finish my sentence and then I'll answer them. But that's the usual way economists present, and that's how we do our seminars, and I'm completely used to that now, and I can't think of any other way of presenting. As you'll see, I'm also just talking off the cuff. I don't have a prepared speech. That's also what we tend to do. If this annoys you, I apologise, but I've never actually written a full speech out and delivered it like that, apart from a best man speech once or twice. But here I'm just going to talk. It's going to be a conversation, even if it's a one-way conversation, like it mostly is when I speak to my undergrads, who are very annoyingly don't ever ask questions. But please feel free to ask at any time. I'm going to motivate what I'm going to do. I'm going to repeat some of the things I've just said, basically, but then with a bit more detail, and then I'll specify the exact research questions that I will focus on. Then I'm going to talk about the famine experiment, the Irish famine experiment, if you like, if you want to call it that. Now, I won't have to go for this audience in as much detail about the causes of the Irish famine, etc., as I would in other audiences. So I will do that, a light version of that, I think, given the context. And then I'll focus a little bit more on the data than I would when I'm presenting to economists, because I think you would be very interested in the data that we've collected and used, and also the way in which we use it may be unfamiliar to you. You maybe hadn't thought about using it in these sorts of data, prison registers in this way. And then the rest of the talk, the empirical strategy, what economists call the empirical strategy, would be where I set up my regression analysis, and I'll try and give you a light version of that, rather than go through all the various different tests we do, and I'll give you just the sort of headline results when I come to the results, and then we can have a discussion afterwards. So before I start, any questions? Everyone clear what I'm going to do? Yeah? Okay. So, I'm going to give you a little 5-minute introduction about anthropometrics. So, have anyone heard of this term before in the room? Yeah? So, most of you haven't. It's the study of physical human attributes, height, weight, all things like that, body mass index. The Nazis, of course, did other things with this. They measured length of nose, size of brain, size of the different fingers on the hands and things like that. Right? So they used it for quite sinister purposes. And it wasn't just the Nazis. It was across Europe, across all countries at the time were collecting vast data sets that included human measurements that we are able to use as social scientists now. Right, so it's more than just that. But it turns out, in particular, that height is a very good indicator of net nutrition. Right, so Peter here is maybe shorter than average in a general population. Right, let's just say shorter than average, shorter than me anyway. Right, is Peter shorter than average because he basically just has bad genes, right? Unlucky, his parents are short. Or is it because he was malnourished during childhood, right? Particular during the ages of 0 and 3, it's the critical period, and then again during adolescence, right? Well, if you have a large enough group of people, we can, on average, say that about 80% of Peter's height is due to genetics, and about 10 to 20%, we can say 20%, biologists disagree about this, and there's a big literature, but let's be safe, say 20% is due to environmental factors, and in particular those that key 0 to 3 period. Right? So there's been a lot of anthropometrics, the study of height and weight out there in the literature. This is from a work by Richard Steckel, and he sort of gives us the mechanism behind how this works, the theory as to what goes into height, someone's height, and what we can then get out of it, what we can learn from it. And Richard Steckel, as an economic historian, has done a lot of work on slaves in the US South, because they are a group of people where we know very well a lot of information about their anthropometric attributes, because they were measured when they were traded, and their measurements were part of their advertisements when they were traded, right? So we can then, one of the things that Richard Steckel has found out, for instance, is that children of slaves were basically malnourished until they were about 11, 12, when they were deemed economically useful on the farm. Until then, they were not basically fed any meat. Right? So they are in the lowest portion of the height distribution. They're very, very small compared to what they should be. Right? But then they catch up when they're economically useful to about, they regain about 75% of the height, and they catch up with their sort of free peers, if you like. So there's some catch-up growth among this slave population. So you think, okay, so it didn't matter. Well, Richard Steckel's argument is that they might have caught up in terms of height, but they didn't in terms of cognitive ability. And this, of course, from the perspective of the slave owner, is a great outcome. You have an army of docile slaves who are not entirely there. Cognitive, their ability is very correlated with height and height development. So they will do what they're told. They won't stand up and make a fuss. So from the perspective of the slave owner, a nice outcome. Now, obviously, from the perspective of looking at these slaves, it's not. And so the study of height has enabled us to try and find out about slave society and how awful it truly was. So, and exactly how, what aspect was so awful. Right? Now, of course, these slaves haven't passed on their bad health and their low cognition, because genetically they're unaltered, right? their children and their children's children, so present day black African Americans, do not obviously have a cognitive disadvantage, but their forebears may have done, or highly likely. So height is just one outcome, but it's correlated with all these other health outcomes. That's why height is so much studied by economic historians, by demographic anthropometric historians in particular. Now, all of what I'm saying works at an average level for a large population. At the individual level, I don't know whether Peter is short because of bad genes or because he was poorly fed, right? So I don't know that. But if I have 1,000 Peters and on average they're all short, then we can start talking about on average what their childhood exposure to nutrition might have been like. Right? So that's a sort of general introduction. Height correlated with all these other non-monetary sources of income. So for societies where we don't have good statistics on wages and consumption baskets and things like that, we can look at height because it's an outcome variable. We can infer to the best data we have what life would have been like. Right, so that's basically sort of a whirlwind introduction to anthropometrics. At this point, is everyone up to speed? Anything that's confusing? Or can I proceed? Yeah, good? Okay.
Leave Peter out of it.
No, I asked him before whether I could make him the butt of my jokes. But that would be enough. So now, the particular debate that this paper speaks to is something called the fetal origins hypothesis, or also known as the Barker hypothesis, after the guy who kind of discovered this. So the fetal origins hypothesis links in particular malnutrition in utero, before birth, and that very, hence fetal origins. And in particular, that exposure of the parent, of the mother, to bad nutrition or no nutrition, and the consequences of that for the fetus and fetal growth. So this literature, some of it's quite heavily debated and contested, but the general consensus, more or less, is that exposure in utero has permanent lifetime impact on terminal height in adulthood, and also other factors. So fetal malnutrition is correlated with depression, with heart disease and diabetes and things like that. So it's a really big deal. But obviously, when we are historians looking at something that's happened over 150 years ago, we can't look at those factors very easily, but we can look at height, because height appears in a lot of historical documents in large quantities, so we have a big data set, and because height is correlated with all those other things, we can do something with it, right? We can actually look at this fetal origins hypothesis, and we can use this as a lens through which we analyse the famine, the Great Irish Famine, to try and understand whether the famine had a permanent impact on famine survivors, all the way into adulthood, right? So children who were born during the famine, they were affected permanently throughout their lives, to such a degree where potentially their output, in terms of their contribution to society, in terms of how much they produce, is lower. So the whole economy is poorer, right, as a result. So one hypothesis is that we've got a test. The famine had a permanent impact, a scarring impact. That's what we call this the scar, right? So about 1.5 centimetres shorter than what someone should be is associated with about 3 or 4 years of life less, and consequently, at the very least, 3 or 4 years life of less production during the lifetime, right? So instead of dying at 50, they're dying at 40, 45, 46. Right? So you know that's a huge impact. But it's more, even whilst they are alive, they're weaker because they're shorter, and it's correlated with weight and cognitive ability and all those sorts of things. So their output per man hour is lower when they're alive even. So overall, potentially there's this big scarring effect, this permanent effect on Irish society that lasts well beyond the famine. Right? So that's one thing, yes?
So if you're looking at height and you're thinking about the impact, you stop growing after a certain point. So are you only looking at individuals who started growing during the famine, so in those critical years?
Yes, so we're looking at those who were exposed in utero up to the age of 3, those critical years. So it's a minus 9 months to 3 years old. So I'll come to that methodology, how we identify this group in a minute, but that's who we're particularly interested in. And there's been a large literature that looks at various different, what economists call natural experiments, and try and measure the impact, the permanent impact of them. All kinds of disasters. Famine is just one of them. War, other, big disease episodes. For instance, the Spanish flu and things like that. People have looked into, and more recently, people have been quite interested in pollution and the impact of pollution in urban environments, in London in particular, on outcomes in adulthood as well. So it's not just a famine, but famine obviously. This particular famine in particular is one to look at because it's has such a huge demographic mortality impact, which brings us to the caveat. So, we are measuring those that survive this famine and reach adulthood. Right? Now, there are a lot of people that don't get that far. They die during the famine because of the famine or its associated diseases. They are not appearing in our data set by definition. Right? So this is the selection effect. Now, these two things could theoretically, and we find evidence that they are, so give away our answer, to give away the story a little bit perhaps, we find evidence that the selection effect among certain parts of Ireland is higher, is more important than the scarring effect. So what does this mean? Well, this means we actually, whilst we should find a height impact, we don't. Indeed, actually, in some cases, we find that average societal height increased. Indeed, we find in areas most severely impacted by famine, average height increased. But it should decrease. How is this possible? Well, the famine is killing off the weak, the short. Right? Because in this period in particular, height matters, and height is correlated with all these other outcomes. These taller people in these sorts of societies are more successful. They live longer. They've got higher average wage, etc., etc. Right? So for societies like Ireland in the mid 19th century, it's a very good indicator, and it's correlated with all these other things. The taller you are, the more successful you're going to be in all these other metrics. The shorter you are, the more potential you have to be affected by famine and its diseases. The more probabilistically you're going to die, and therefore not appear in our data set. So there's these two effects, and demographers have noticed this for a long time. But when economic historians have looked at height as a measure, they haven't worried so much about these selection effects. So when people were looking, for instance, when Richard Stecker was looking at the slaves in the US South, there was no discussion of selection in that way. Of course, with the slaves in the US South, there's also a huge selection effect, right? So the slaves imported from Africa, when they arrive, half the ship is basically dead, right? The weakest half, who haven't survived the voyage, that's a huge selection effect just from the get-go. Right? So there's that's also an example that we have to consider and have to think about the impact of that selection on what we infer about that society in terms of its societal health. Right?
Chris, couldn't the selection effect be quite complicated?
Yes.
Because some of the more cunning, it might be quite small, might well survive,
Mm-hmm.
and also because you've got emigration, which is creaming off selectively.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a kind of double selection going on there.
You're completely right. I've simplified this here to just say, its mortality is the selection device, but migration is the other big one. And we try and look at both in this paper, right? And whether migrants are more likely to be taller or shorter is something that is much less clearly, much less clear. The mortality one is easier to get a handle on. The migration one is much more difficult and nuanced, perhaps, and something we've got to work on. Yes, but we'll come back to that. Any other questions at this point? What we did, just as a motivation for this research, is we looked at across studies. These are studies that Cormac O'Gorda put in his literature review survey of famines in history. Here we have the change in adult height in this axis, and this is in centimetres. So 1.5 is a huge. It means a huge. It's quite a huge impact. And here we have the mortality rate of that particular famine episode. Now, of course, Ireland during the famine mortality rate would be off the scale. It'd be more like 12-13%, right over here. So it doesn't even figure. But what we see here is that famines with very low mortality impact, so those where people are malnourished but they don't die, those are the exact studies in which we find societal height is lower as a consequence. Right? Those with very high mortality impact, you see actually societal height in adulthood has no impact or people are actually taller. So this is of course each one of these points is one study. What we're able to do with our data is look at all the different points within one famine episode. Right? So we are able to exploit the Irish famine and the richness of the data available on individuals exposed to the Great Irish Famine to try and we've basically found the same relationship across one famine episode because we know what area our individuals were born in, i.e. the ecological exposure to famine conditions, and we know their adult height, and of course across Ireland. The famine had an impact differentially. So some parts of Ireland had an impact, had a higher mortality rate than other parts of the island. So we can infer how much famine, if you like, was around when they were born, and from that their exposure to famine conditions. It's not perfect. We don't actually know whether someone was malnourished or not during infancy, but we can, with a large enough data set, we can infer on average. You see, and we find the same sort of pattern. So we find, in particular, those born in say, Tipperary, where which Clonmel Jail mostly serves, are at this end of the scale, very high famine mortality, and no height or very little height impact, or in fact positive. And those born in Dublin, which did not have a famine, or not as we would traditionally say, there's no excess mortality or very low excess mortality. It was mostly migrants coming in from the rest of the island. They would be down here. They actually see a 1.5 centimetre roughly, or 2.2 in some of our econometric specifications. They're shorter, and that sounds like a small number, but it's not in terms of health impact. That's correlated with huge effects.
Chris,
yeah.
Taking advantage of the economist's approach, which
yes,
I very
please
much
do.
approve of. I'm just wondering how you calculated excess mortality for districts like, say, Tipperary or a part of Tipperary. It's not population decline or in using Mokeers County?
We're using Mokeers data,
Okay.
and we hope to improve that with Alan Ferneyhouse data, because he's doing it by parish, whereas Joe Mokeer did it by county, and it's excess mortality, so it includes also those who essentially failed to be born, in addition to actual death, right? So it's a bit, and he uses this he looks at the census and sort of does some fancy maths. Well, not actually, it's not so fancy, but he sort of tries to find the missing people, and so that's what we do. It's by county level. It's quite crude in a sense. What we do, a measure of famine exposure. But if you want a geographic measure of famine exposure, right, that's the sort of measure you could that we have access to. Right. If someone can think of something more that will give us an indicator of famine exposure with a geographic coordinate.
Could just add to that. I think Cormac has an alternative set of county excess mortality rates, which are not terribly different from Mokeers, but they are different.
Okay, so we could use that too. We'll test that. I'll just write that down. Yeah.
There's also a different set in Willie Smith's Atlas of the Great Irish Famine. He has a different county level mortality estimate.
Molly Smith.
Willie Smith.
Willie. Okay, well, Willie. Okay. I have that. That I thought he uses Joe Mokeer's data.
No, it's varied.
It's varied. Okay, so. Okay, so we will test that. That's a good idea. Yeah. But it gives the same sort of ranking though of counties, does it? Like it's still the famine is most impactful where in the west, right? It still has that general pattern. Does it change the ordering of the counties?
The difference is Mokeer's kind of epicenter is North Connaught. It's Mayo and Sligo.
Right.
Whereas the Smith data pushes more towards South Connaught,
Okay.
and Clare. Clare is a big difference.
Okay, so it does change the rank order slightly. Okay.
I mean, Willie is a wonderful historical geographer, but I doubt if he went through this in great detail. The reason I say this is he has, in the beginning of that volume, 1/3 of Irish landlords helped their tenants, 1/3 were indifferent, and 1/3 were dreadful. So I sent him an email asking how this had been calculated, or alternatively, was it a case of Gaul is divided into 3 parts? I got no reply, which suggests that this was more impressionistic than.
Okay. Well, we can put it in an appendix just to test why not. So this is actually from our data. So you see here's the mortality, excess mortality, Ireland as a whole, and this line is height in Tipperary among our Tipperary prisoners, terminal adult height. So there's a sort of a decline in height actually before the famine for those born before, but there's actually around the famine nothing happening or an increase, and then there's nothing afterwards. Right, so these are born in Tipperary, imprisoned in Tipperary. And here we see Dublin, so there's nothing really happening or a negative impact, right? About 1.5 to 2 centimetres among those born in Dublin, imprisoned in Dublin. Now, this on the graph may not look like a lot, but it is. This is a huge result. Maybe if we change the scale a bit. Of course, you can play about the scale and make things look bigger or smaller than they are, but maybe that's something we should make it look a bit bigger than it is. Now, of course, those born in Tipperary are, on average, taller than those in Dublin because there's something called an urban penalty. So if you're born in a large, dirty, disease-riddled city with poor housing, you're on average going to be worse off than those born in more rural locales where you have access, initially at least, to plentiful supply of this great superfood called the potato, which basically deals with all our needs. Right? It's an amazing thing. You can survive literally just off potatoes, maybe a little bit of buttermilk or bacon fat or something like that on the side, but basically much more nutritious environment before famine hits. Right? Now, what we've done here is we've normalised it to try and look at year-on-year impact of the famine, and this here you can actually see what we're trying to get at more easily, perhaps. So this is the average adult height as an index number, and this is years born since outbreak. The outbreak of famine in 1844. Now we can debate the exact start date, and this is probably a year earlier than most measurements. But if we want to capture those born in utero, those impacted in utero, we have to do that at the very least. Start it 1 year earlier. And here again we see those born in Tipperary and who reach adulthood. They survive the famine, and we measure them in adulthood. Nothing is really happening to their height. Those born in Dublin, imprisoned in Dublin, however, there is quite a huge comparative impact on their height, associated. It's almost the same path as the German famine that resulted from World War I. So at the end of World War I, there was also a famine in Germany, a famine in which there was very low mortality, like in Dublin, right, where everyone survived, but those that survived were shorter on average than those born before or after the First World War. Right, and so for the German data, it's another paper Matthias has done. He uses conscripts into the to the German army in World War II who were born before, during, and after the First World War. So it's the same path. So we're finding what we find in a low mortality famine in Ireland. So these are have taken quite a while to get this point, but I think it was needed. These are our core then research questions. When does a famine affect human and health capital? Was the generation born during the Great Irish Famine scarred or selected? Or both? Right? Is there a differential impact? Was there a difference between pre-famine, famine and post-famine born birth cohorts? Right? Is there this difference? And was the difference in cohort effects, is there one observable by region? So are some regions that are affected less by famine have more of the scarring or more of the selection? Right? And we saw from the figure, I've kind of given away the headline results, which is also what economists tend to do. Rather than wait for the punchline at the end, we give the story away. But that gives you an idea of what's to come. So I'll go over this section of the talk maybe a little bit more quickly. The potato, the superfood, it allowed parts of Ireland to be settled that we would otherwise consider marginal. Right? The potato being this superfood allowed parts of Ireland to survive. It was on just this one crop. It was a monoculture. So when this one crop is blighted with this this infection, this fungus, which I cannot pronounce, it's a disaster, right? Now the same fungus hit Belgium, for instance, and some of Scotland, but it was less of a disaster. There were substitutes to potato more readily available. Not the case in Ireland. About a third of the potato crop was lost in 45. Near total crop failure in 46 or 48, and excess mortality. So when the real the death toll starts going up is from the summer of 46. So in 1841, just before the famine, population in Ireland is about 45% of that of Great Britain. Right. In 1901, 60 years later, it's only 12%. So it has a permanent demographic impact. Alongside, of course, migration, which you can link into famine anyway, the two feeding off each other. Right, here we have famine mortality by county and famine migration by county. So the two are quite correlated, but not perfectly. The darker the colour, the more, the higher the mortality. It is excess mortality is defined as deaths per 1,000 of the population, and this is basically based off Joel Mokier's work. And here for emigration rates, we have emigrants per 1,000 of the population again. So we see that Dublin, it doesn't have any excess mortality, or not compared to the rest of the island anyway, and in fact sucks in migrants from the rest of the island. Some of which go on to the New World or to Britain, but many of which stay. Right? So this is one of the reasons why Dublin sort of maintains this high population relative to the rest of the island. So this is what we use to because we can locate all our prisoners to their county of origin. And in Clonmel and Kilmainham, we don't just have individuals who were born in County Dublin or County Tipperary. In particular, in Clonmel, we get quite a lot of coverage. So we found this little icon here. It's a little stick man behind bars. I'm very, very happy with that. That little ArcGIS icon that we found. Yeah. So that's one data input into our study. Now, I think Ireland and the Great Irish Famine have long been sort of cast in this: is it a Malthusian demographic shock or not? Debate. Right? Lots of people have contributed to this. Joel Mokier famously saying it's not. Others re-evaluating this. There's a huge literature there, but let's put that aside for the moment. Let's focus on the fact that Malthus himself was aware of scarring. He himself, in his Opus Magnus, talked about the lower orders of society, in particular, being stunted in their growth. He's noticing this. So he's noticing correlation between basically poverty and height. Right? Through casual observation. Now, what we can do with our data is actually empirically we can do a much better job thanks to computing power, basically, than Malthus ever was. But it's already demographers have been aware of this thing for a lot longer, perhaps, than economic historians. And economic historians in the 20th century, late 20th century, then became aware. Maybe we can actually use this. And do something more with it, because it but it's a quite a long held idea. But I'm not going to really get into the debate: is this a Malthusian shock or not? That's for someone else in another paper. There's been quite a lot of work which looks at height in the Irish context. Even Bob Fogel, in a paper, he's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, economic historian, talks about, uses some Irish data. But it's mostly those that survived the famine but are measured abroad. These are migrants. Those aren't the people that survived and stayed in the island. Why are we interested in those that stayed? Because they're your ancestors, right? You're their direct descendants, some of you anyway. So it's important to look at those who stayed. Australian transportee records, well, they're Australians now, right? East India Company, well, some of those may have returned, but we're not sure. Military records, these are mostly American military in the American Civil War, and those born in Ireland and then fighting for the North or the South in the American Civil War. And then prison registers, Cormac O'Gorda has looked at a Kilmainham jail, but what he does is he takes people imprisoned during the famine, right, and looks at their heights and things like that. We are looking at people born during the famine, imprisoned later. And of course, when he was doing this, he mostly did this in the 80s. There was computers aren't what they are today, so he's dealing with much smaller data sets, and he hasn't got all their other demographic attributes. He isn't able to do multivariate analysis, looking at height controlling for, say, religion. Which you have to do, because of course Protestants are always going to be taller than Catholics, right? As I shall explain in a minute. So you have to do that at the very least. Or controlling for the crime you're in for. Murderers are always shorter than political prisoners. Right? They're always going to be. Crimes associated with poverty and prostitution, they're going to be shorter than people who are in for more sophisticated property crimes, things like that. So we've got to control for all these things. So we can do more sophisticated analysis and we have better data. Because existing studies mostly is born during the famine, or they refer to Irish born found elsewhere in the world. So they've left Ireland. So we can't infer anything about Ireland from those that leave, by definition. That's the idea. Now there is this one study, the Harvard Anthropological Survey of Ireland, which was conducted right at the beginning of the 20th century. These guys were Nazis, right? So they went around Ireland measuring people, not just their height, but all sorts of things, and they were trying to infer from that why the Irish, they had a sort of a social agenda behind that. Why the Irish poor was because as a race they're inferior. That's kind of the idea. But people have discovered this data set, and actually the Harvard Anthropological Survey people were quite disappointed with what they found because the Irish were much taller than British on average. They were a bit disappointed with that little outcome. But this data has been rediscovered and used to try and backwards infer something about the famine, which they do. But they're only getting really old people. So not just survivors of the famine, but people who really got into a very late, into their 60s and 70s, right? So that's not, we're getting people that have survived the famine and entered the prison system in the 1850s, the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, right? So we're getting people at the prime of their life, right? So it's a little bit different. So we don't have, that's going to have a lot of scarring, a lot of selection issue inbuilt, because you're only getting those very old people who tend to shrink anyway. Old people shrink every year from a little bit, so you have to take that into account. There's also been a lot of literature done on other famines, in particular the Chinese Great Leap Forward famine. So this is during the Chinese Great Leap Forward, when Mao did some crazy stuff and lots of people died. So there's papers in development economics journals in particular. These haven't appeared in history journals, economic history journals, but it is historical data that they deal with. So there's these great surveys that they do that they've done in say the last decade, that we've been able to use, that a bunch of Chinese scholars and Swedish scholars have been able to use to try and understand the permanent impact of famine, and they indeed find this anthropometric shock, this shock to height, right? But they also find evidence of this selection issue, which they kind of are puzzled by. They don't really explore, so they have a correction factor. They say, well, we should have found this result, but we don't, so there must be something wrong with our data or something. But they don't think, but actually they're only capturing those who survived the Great Leap Forward famine. And anyway, compared to the Great Irish Famine, the Great Leap Forward famine was nothing, right? In terms of overall demographic effect, proportional to the whole population, yes, a lot more people died in China than in Ireland, but as a percentage of population, it pales into insignificance compared to the Irish famine. So our data, our case study, our natural experiment is better for looking at this development economics question.
Is
yes.
there an element of statistical dilution in saying the victims of the Great Leap Forward are a small proportion of the Chinese population?
Yeah, it's a bit naughty what I've just said, but
yeah, if you look at some of the badly affected regions within China, then the proportion rises.
Of course. So it's not fair what I said in that sense, because yes, areas that are very severely impacted. I always tell my students off for using the word impact as a verb, and I've just done it about 10 times in the space of the last 30 minutes, but I apologise. But yes, it was a bit naughty what I said. Fair, I take that point. One thing that we've really got to think about throughout this study is crime is a social construct. Right? So, all of a sudden, in the 1860s, for instance, drunkenness in Ireland becomes a crime. Before then, it wasn't a crime. Right? they start punishing drunkenness with prison sentences a bit shortly after, rather than just a fine. So we have all these drunkards arriving in our data set. Now this is a problem that we have to think about, because not only have we got a selection through mortality, but we've got selection into our data set for the crime that people are committing. So we need to be very aware of the institutional context when we look at our data and try and control for these things. So this is the source. Everyone who enters any jail in Ireland, or pretty much anywhere, there's been work on Belgium recently that uses a similar source. So all their individual level demographic details are recorded in these amazing volumes. So we recently got a small grant from the Economic History Society to start digitising some from here in Belfast. So we want to do a paper that uses this methodology for Belfast soon. But this is I think this is actually Belfast, right? So this was one of photos we recently took, but it's the same layout for all the prisons. So you have the name, you have a description in terms of eye colour and all those unique identifying characteristics, because of course this is a society without passports or ID cards, without fingerprinting technology, what comes in very late in the 1880s, 1890s. So you have to be able to identify people, right? So they do it this way, to the best of their ability. What we're able to do is actually control for repeat offenders, because if they have the same characteristics, the same name and attributes, we know that they're the same person. So you don't want to double count people, so we control for that. We also have, I've got a list here. We've got the age, which is what we use in our economic history review paper. Height is what we use in this paper. Place of birth and place of residence when they committed the crime. The occupation. Now many of them do not have an occupation, they're unemployed, but even those that are unemployed tend to have a profession or an occupation that I guess they would ideally want to be. So we captured a bit of that as well. We have their level of literacy, reading and writing individually, although those two are very highly correlated. We mostly put them together. We have religion, marital status, the crime that they're in for, and the dates of sentence and release. Now for crime, there are hundreds, thousands of different crimes. So what we do is we use contemporary criminal classification. We classify the crimes into about 6 different groups, right? Crimes against the person with or without violence, political crime, crimes of poverty, etc., etc. So we can really get a hold of all those different groups, because you can't lump them all together because they're going to innately be different and different over time. Right? So Kilmainham Jail is operational between 1796 and 1910. The prison records only start, the ones that survive, the systematic records, much later in the sort of 1830s, the ones that we can use. But there's enough time to get that pre-famine cohort included. It's the county jail for Dublin County, but it later also holds individuals that are destined for exportation to the colonies, although Mountjoy, the other prison in Dublin, later takes some of those too, and then when they stop doing that, the hardened criminals, if you like, end up in Mountjoy prison, so we get the lesser criminals, which is great because it's more representative of society, because this is a society with a very high incarceration rate. Lots of people going to jail for very minor things, just 24 hours in jail for drunkenness, that kind of thing. It's really, really small petty crimes. So we're getting quite a representative data set from that point of view, right? It's mostly the lower middle classes, right? If you're richer, for some of these crimes you can pay a fine instead of going to jail. That's true, but we want the lower classes, if you like, and the lower middle classes anyway, because those are the groups within society that are most likely to be affected by famine anyway. Those who are richer, so our data is biased, but it's biased in the way we've got a lamppost shining on a part of the street. We're missing everywhere else, but it's the exact part of the street where we want to look anyway. Right? So it's illuminating this part. The majority of prisoners were, if you like, ordinary decent criminals. Now there are people in for an assortment of political crimes. Of course, Kilmainham Jail is a national monument commemorating those political crimes, if you like, today. But we're able to control for those individuals, because we know who they are. We can take them out of the data set, or we can control for them in the overall trends. Right? We know when these political events are occurring, so we know the crimes that they're in for. Now, for Clonmel, it's a garrison town. It's quite a big deal for the area. It experiences some political insurrection. So there is some stuff going on down that part of the island. Has a very differing experience of emigration than Kilmainham, and compared to other parts of the country as well. So they're nice counterpoints, right? So they give us two extremes, if you like. It's not up there, right? So we don't have a prison where the famine really hits very hard, but it's sort of in the top third of Joel Maokir's list of death list, if you like, of counties most affected. It's in the top third of counties most impacted by, there I go again, most have highest impact of famine. Right? Maybe I should give up on that and just let's go with it. Right. So Ireland's criminal justice system, we try and control for how people end up into the prison, and the paper goes into a lot of these institutional details I don't have time to go into now, but the paper's online if you want to read it, the working paper. Right? So we need to really think about all the institutional nuance of the piece. So here we see incarceration rates across the century, or the second half of the 19th century. We see a huge increase in incarceration rate. I think this is just this is on the national statistics, right, from parliamentary papers. Around the time of the famine, right, we would expect that people are forced into prison of desperation. Even the stories of people choosing to go to prison because the rations were higher, that kind of anecdotal story, that kind of thing. But of course, we're not interested in those people who end up in prison during famine. We're interested in those people during more normal times who were born during the famine, right? And who entered the period afterwards. This homicide rate is used by historians of crime as a sort of overall indicator of criminality in society. The idea is that it doesn't really necessarily depend on economic factors as much as other sorts of crime. It's crime of passion and things like that. Rich people and poor people do a bit of murdering, irrespective of their social status, right? So it gives you a sort of, and it's pretty constant throughout the century there. And we can control for not just the famine. We don't even take individuals from there, but we can control for other political events, and we can also see these lines here. We control for what we call prison regimes, when there's a huge change in prison rules, and in particular the one here in the mid 1870s to do with how crime was punished in the ways in which it was punished. So we have to control for that. So we have one specification where we just take individuals from this period, so that crime is a constant definition throughout the period. And we do another specification where we can control from where they've been plucked from the distribution. So here we have some descriptive statistics for Kilmainham and Clonmel. Just the sheer number of observations. We have. It's for historians. This is big data. Now, economists, when they talk about big data, they talk about millions of observations. But for historians, I'm pretty proud of this. We have. For the cohort, the 10-year, if we define a 10-year window, before the famine, during the famine and after the famine, and then we can be more specific. So here we define a period, core famine, those affected in particular by those born during the core famine year. So we have these different specifications, those born local to the prison, those born in other parts of the country. We have their height, their age, and whether they're Protestant or Catholic. This is the proportion of people So overwhelmingly, of course, Catholic, given where the prisons are located. It's only about 5-6% of those in Dublin are Protestant. In fact, the Protestants are underrepresented. Right? So if you compare this to the census, there are fewer Protestants than there should be. So we also re-weight our data to look like the census. So that's one additional test we do. So basically, we weight Catholics lower than we do Protestants to try and rebalance. And here we see the data for Clonmel. A few observations. Obviously, for Clonmel, it's a smaller jail. It's a less populated part of the country. And we've got a control for literacy also. Taller people tend to be more literate. Right? Statistically significantly higher. Now, of course, none of this works for today's society. Obviously, height is not an indicator very much, especially in a developed country, or if you want to call it that, like Northern Ireland. It doesn't really indicate very much. But at this time, at this level of development, it gives us a lot. Here we have these different criminal classifications and years of conviction, and then something that we do is we also know not just excess mortality due to famine, but we have an instrumental variable in which we look at access to pre-famine health infrastructure, in particular access to fever hospitals. The idea being, if you have access to a fever hospital in your area, you have some sort of infrastructure there to limit. The counterfactual is that a lot more mortality would have been there in the absence of that health infrastructure. Now, whether this is debatable, whether the fever hospital infrastructure maybe just a drip in the ocean as to what was needed, but it's better than nothing. It might be correlated with other things, right? So here we see a height histogram, the old distribution of height in Kilmainham and Clonmel, and obviously there's greater proportion of people. This is across before, during, and after. This is everyone lumped together. There's taller people in Clonmel. It's a different distribution. The average is higher, and there's fewer extremes, which is already an indicator that something's weird with the data. Some selection effect is happening. But the average height overall, we would expect that because of this rural-urban difference, this urban penalty. So, given the time I have left, I want to have some time for discussion. What comes next is after the empirical strategy, and then loads of equations. Right? I'm going to skip over all those equations, but just the baseline results. The main thing I want you to focus on is what we're doing is we're testing the difference in final average male height. We just look at men. We have women in our data set too, but you have to treat them differently. And anyway, to start with, but we don't have as many women, and women are in for various other crimes. There's a lot more prostitutes and things, as you would imagine. It's not as representative and things like that. So there's problems with that with the women in our data set for Kilmainham anyway. So it's just not as many. So you can't do everything in the paper. So we focus in this paper at least just on men. So we test the difference in final average adult height between famine-born cohorts and cohorts born either the decade or the 5-year period before or after. So the idea is the strategy aims to capture the effect of malnutrition and the worsened disease environment experienced by that famine-born cohort, i.e. we're capturing the potential for stunted growth. And there's these two hypotheses that we explicitly testing for. Is this effect should result in a height drop for individuals in locations where famine conditions were most severe. Alternatively, if there's no effect, it implies an extreme selection. So those that were affected by famine die, and so don't appear in our data set, so they were not measured, they don't go to prison, right, because they're dead, essentially. We use varying definitions of this famine window, because the exact age of these prisoners is unknown. It's an estimate. They are basically estimating their own age. And there's this thing called age heaping, which is something I've written on before with Matthias and Eoin and Laura, which has an effect on the data. So we can't be entirely precise about who exactly was influenced by famine, so we use various definitions and look at different specifications. but they all come out with the same general results. So we do this thing that economists love called instrumental variable analysis. Instead of looking at the exact incidence of famine, the mortality index from Jerome Oke's work, we look at something that's correlated with famine impact. Not perfectly correlated, mind, because that would have all kinds of statistical properties that would be undesirable, but something that is a general indicator of and is independently measured of. So there's, I could have a whole lecture on instrumental variable analysis, but I'm not going to. Instead, I'm just going to just show you this map here, and we see where the famine, the fever hospitals are located, this pre-famine health infrastructure, and the idea is that fever hospitals are part of this pre-existing infrastructure that is not their location is not directly correlated with local wealth or anything like that. It's more to do with a consequence of social hierarchies and patronage of landlords and things like that. So this I can't remember. This is something that Eoin focused on in the paper, but there's a lot of historians have looked at these. In fact, there's whole books on it. I can't remember the authors, but so we've tried to use this as a sort of robustness check in our analysis, and we do things like weighted regressions because. Catholics and illiterates are overrepresented, things like that. We also check for adolescence because the second most important period of growth is early in adolescence, 13 to 17 is for male, and we find the same impacts for adolescents. They also grow. They're also stunted or selected in a similar sort of way. Right. So these are the results. I'm just going to show you this one. So the coefficient here is basically centimeters, right? So this is showing you that actually those born during the famine are who were born in Dublin and incarcerated in Dublin during the famine are slightly shorter than those before, and those born immediately after are shorter again. And we can divide this up by those measured in Dublin but born elsewhere in Ireland, etc. Right? And if you compare this to Clonmel, we have actually, because these are negative sign, those born before and after the famine are actually shorter than those born during the famine. So it's the exact opposite way to what you would expect. We have to, if we put that coefficient together with the coefficient for Catholic, coefficient for literacy and stuff like that, we can get, if you are Catholic and literate and in for a certain crime, this will be your height on average, right? So that's what we can do from the data, basically. But I given that you're not econometricians, I'm going to, unless someone wants to go over the detail, I'm going to leave it at that. And we try and do everything we can think of with the data. And I presented this on Friday at Trinity College, and they gave me a couple of other ideas of what to do with the data too. But we try and do everything we possibly can, and everything we've done so far comes up with the same result, right? So, just to conclude, then, summary of the findings: the Great Irish Famine was one of the most significant famines to hit the modern world. We find only a small or no health effect on the residual population in Dublin. And we find no or even a positive effect among rural population in Tipperary. So given that the famine hits Tipperary most, it's surprising results, very surprising, and it surprised a lot of people we've presented this to, shown this to, right? But basically our answer is because selection is greater than scurrying. It's quite an obvious answer. It's a question that people maybe hadn't thought of, or when they're doing their anthropometrics. But it's actually pretty obvious. You have to take into account who survives and who you're measuring. So this leads to this question: well, where did all these famine victims go? If they're not in our data set, well, reduced fertility. these people are not actually getting born to begin with. We include that in the mortality metric, right? So the Joel Mokir's statistics also take into account those who should have been born but weren't, right? We have good archaeological evidence from things like mass graves that those born during the famine, or those who died during the famine anyway, or those who died later on in the century or born in the famine, were malnourished and shorter and all these sorts of things. Now, it's the data is not, we're doing with hundreds of observations, not thousands like us. But from Beaumont's work on workhouse burial sites, it suggests that obviously there was malnutrition in famine-stricken areas. It's quite obvious. You can see it from the bone decay, the bone records, and things like that. So yes, the famine was a big deal. It's not, it's not made up. It's not fake news. So something, obviously. So mortality is one issue. So. Basically, the idea is those who are affected by famine are dying and they end up in the burial site. They're not surviving the famine, right? And then migration is the other one. So we see even from grave sites in London and the Lunkin Street Cemetery, where it's just full of Irish migrants who living in London, and they all basically in the same parish and have they're all part of this extended Irish community in London. They all ended up in the same cemetery, and those individuals were quite clearly those affected by famine, those born during famine. So maybe Ireland is exporting its bad health. So the idea then, who is leaving Ireland? Well, it's those who potentially had a more severe, greater experience of famine, not those that are better off in society. They tend to stay. So what's the bottom line? Well, your ancestors survived a famine and were relatively okay, right? They did well out of it. They survived, no problem, right? If your ancestors are from rural areas, if your ancestors are from more urban locales, then there was potentially a scarring effect. Although they didn't die. So we need to sort of take into account this sort of thing when we look at famines in general and the Irish famine, in the Great Irish Famine in particular. So as I said, our data particularly focus on working class individuals, given the nature of who we're measuring. Yes, and I think that's the end of my talk. So I'm open to any questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've got time for questions. Could I start?
Yes.
But obviously, potentially the biggest imbalance, kind of spoke about this very briefly, is the gender imbalance in studies. The problem with many of the anthropometric studies is that the data sets are very much skewed towards male data.
Yes.
Obviously, the military recruitment in particular, but also to a significant degree, there's obviously many more men imprisoned in the course of the 19th century than women, so there are fewer women in your data set. But I mean, potentially does that cause some problems? Because there may be both physiological and social reasons why female infants may be fed or nourished in different ways to male infants. I mean, it's hypothetically at least a variable that might be needed to be taken into consideration.
Yes, so you're absolutely right in that the experience of famine, men and women, differs. Whether it also matters in utero, whether there's a higher survival probability if you're a male or female baby, fetus, something I would need to think about. But that's why I think we restrict our conclusions to men at the moment, and whether we do something specifically focused on the female prisoners is maybe something to do next, but we don't have as many. So we can't be as sure about our analysis because, as I said, this inference works for large numbers, but if you're talking about 10 or 20 or 30 people, you can't say whether it's genetics or whether it's exposure during childhood, right? So you need large numbers. But I think we might be able to do that for Clonmel. We have more female prisoners there than in Kilmainham, so at least for the crucial periods. But you're absolutely right. Those mortality statistics, for instance, are for men and women. So we should actually, at the very least, look at male mortality versus female mortality when we use that measure. Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Okay. Yes.
On this note, I would like to add the fact that I work myself on criminality, and 10% of women just usually tends to be in the prison, so they are not representative in society, and this is a big problem. But I was wondering if, like other institutions, like for example nunneries or the Catholics, could be a kind of good source for papers for knowing which year they were born, which health, if they have this kind of things, trying to turn around the problem. And I don't know if.
So certainly, the paper that we did published last year, we used data from the workhouse, and which also records height. So we got quite a large number of women from that source. And nunneries, I'm not sure if there's admittance records with height as a variable, but also I don't think the numbers are great enough. I mean, there's probably a lot of nuns in Ireland, but we're not that many, right? Compared to say number of people go to the workhouse. Yeah.
And what about orphanages?
Orphanages, yes. So if we focus on adult height, they're not very useful. But if we change the question to maybe the famine has an impact on the growth curve, right? So actually there was, I had one here, or did I go past it? No. Here, adolescence. So the modern UK standard we see from this dotted line when people are the annual average growth in centimetres. We see when children are growing. It's much earlier than say Manchester factory workers in the 19th century or Edinburgh students, which were also measured. Eoin found an amazing source in Edinburgh University archive. No, St Andrews University archive or something like that. They tend to, both basically the poor and the rich were having their growth spurts later, right? So maybe in the workhouse it's even later. In the orphanage it was even later if they're exposed to differential nutrition. Or maybe they're better off than people who are not in the orphanage. I don't know very much about orphanages, or actually I don't know anything about orphanages in Ireland in this period. Were there a lot of orphanages, or is this something we should explore, do you think?
Probably no better, but they're more of a post-famine phenomenon, aren't they? I mean, the workhouse acts as the orphanage for the rural poor anyway. Yeah. You've got sort of, I suppose, charitable orphanages often associated with Protestant churches in the urban areas. Catholic orphanages don't come until later in the century with the money coming from the charitable collects act. I think so.
Yeah. But we do want to write a paper on children, because there's an amazing register here in Belfast, but we need to find some more money to digitise it, which even says, is the child a bastard or not? So we can look at illegitimacy. Of course, many people have used these registers before. We've got colleagues here in the history school that use them, but they use them for different reasons. They look at the individual, right, and they focus on their life story or their criminal careers or whatever it is, right? We're not interested in individuals. We're interested in whole population, right? So we only use someone's name as a unique key to link them over time, whether they re-enter the prison system or to infer gender from, or that sort of thing. So there's the difference. We're using same source that historians may use, but for a different purpose. But certainly, if we were to look at the prison register for children here in Belfast, it would be nice to actually get workhouse children or orphanage children as a comparison. That was a good idea for a new paper, yeah.
A very quick comment, question, because I've got to run to do some child minding in a moment.
Oh yeah, no.
Very, negative time, slightly. There is a complication which goes back to Mokir's estimates of excess mortality. See, it's very easy for us to look at changes in population at an island level, a county level, parish level, or whatever, between, say, 1841 and 1851. The figures are pretty sound. Or even 1845, even the famine in 1851. But Eoin Mokir's work in calculating excess mortality relies heavily on assumptions about migration levels at a county level. So in a way, his excess mortality estimates are not as independent of issues like migration as one would wish. Now, he may well have, got it largely right, but he may not, which is a little bit of concern. Could I say I think it's a wonderful paper, a wonderful approach, and really interesting questions.
Thanks. We had mentioned that during the presentation. I think we've got to go back to those statistics and maybe use other people's estimates, or I'm not sure it's something we can do ourselves, although Alan Ferneyhough is doing it with parish registers, rather, so it's a smaller unit of observation, and maybe we should use his data, although it's not published, rather than, or in addition to Joe Mokir's data. Maybe, if you saw a paper that did that, would you be, and it found the same result, same surprising results, would you believe it more, do you think?
Oh, I quite believe this. It's not, and I'm not saying remotely to jettison Eoin Mokir's estimates. I'm just saying that there is I think that it's the county migration rates is the Achilles heel in his calculations.
Okay.
Well, that problem would transfer over into parish migration rates as well.
Yes.
But I'm not sure Alan's doing that. So I'm not sure. So he's got parish, because there's no census remaining, but there's like parish census equivalents or parish registers, and so I'm not sure he's making assumptions about migration. But so we could try and use that. Thanks, Ian. Or we could try and take maybe Joe Mokir's migration figures out of his estimates or something like that. But the idea is, I guess we're trying to do everything that everyone says. Every test, and you saw there's many tests and tables there, and we keep finding the same thing. Every way we do it. So if we use a different data set for famine impact, and we find the same thing, I guess it would strengthen our results. But mortality is just one indicator of famine impact. If you have any other suggestions as to what would be a good measure, I don't know, number of houses demolished or something but I'm not sure such figures really exist. I don't know, like to get a grip on quantitatively the degree of famine exposure in a particular area is difficult. So if you have any other sort of ideas of indicators, very happy to hear.
Well, reduction in the proportion of fourth class housing in the 51 census would be the closest there.
That's a good idea.
Suggested, as opposed to 1841. Any other questions? What anyone wants to raise? Yes.
Chris said that you said that Working Bureau was online.
Yes.
Could you direct us to that?
Yes, it's a long URL, but you can actually find it on the. It's quite short. If you what's this? Ask me later. You go to quceh.org.uk. Where's the? So this is the Queen's University Centre for Economic History, which is QUCEH. And then if you click on Working Papers, it's right there. Right, it's just a list of working papers. So this is obviously a tradition in economics to put working papers up there, but the caveat is hasn't been submitted to a journal, it hasn't undergone peer review, right? So this is a work in progress. But yeah, you can see them all from various papers from the research centre, but you'll find ours there. Yeah.
Can I just raise one final issue, Chris? I think the idea of selection is a persuasive one, particularly, juxtaposed with other information we have about the rates of infant mortality during the Great Famine, the higher susceptibility of infants to famine-related diseases. The potentially problematic area is emigration as a source of selection in the light of, say, things like Cormac O'Rourke and Tim Boyne's thesis about a poverty trap restricting the ability of the poorest to emigrate, because obviously there are costs involved in emigration, whether it's across the Irish Sea or more expensive crossings to North America. There's also, there's also a tendency in the emigration literature to stress the dominance of young adult men and women as the principal age cohorts of immigrants rather than family groups. So the kind of removal of large numbers of infants through emigration during the Great Famine, I think, would be contradicted by some of the other literature. So that might be a bit of a problem as a kind of major driver of starvation.
Yeah, I think getting a better hold on migration is necessary if we want to submit this to an economics journal, because these are the sorts of things that they will be asking as well. Obviously, the reviewers will be interested for different reasons than historians, but they'll essentially be asking the same sort of thing. This other driver that you mentioned in your paper, migration, you're not really measuring it very well, so I think we've got to do more on that. And certainly, you're right, Tim Ganane has that book that has a fancy title,
The
Disappearing Irish. Yeah. So, engaging with some of that might be an idea. Yeah.
All right, Chris, that's a really interesting paper. Lots of you told us a lot about methodology as well.
Sorry if I bored you to death with that.
Well, not for me anyway. For the others in the room as well, it's been absolutely fascinating. I was more comfortable when you moved away from sort of assessing my own.
Sorry for making you the butt of the joke, but we always need to choose someone. Yeah.